Anyway, nice to see you all. Obviously, this is a different day and a different time, but there's always something in polo, as we know. This is Billy Stevens from Milwaukee, who ran JoyFarm for years and years, and I know Merle's got a lot of comments about this, but he's been around a while, so it's got to be a long story, so we might as well get started.
Gee, I have a mic. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for asking me, Chris. I don't give very many speeches, like none. But I can talk a lot about some of the players I've played with over the years. I played for over 60 years. I started as a young kid, 14, in Detroit, Michigan. And my stepfather, Donald McCarroll, they called him Mac, had a riding stable, and he had some horses, and he played polo with the Detroit club. There was a Ivory family that had a club nearby his stable, and we used to ride a horse and lead another horse over to the Ivory field and play polo. John F. Ivory was a real character. He discovered everything. He told you when you're going to play, what periods, and who you're going to play with, and just about everything about except what horse you're going to ride. He was a tough guy. His son Jack Ivory played, and he started very young, and he became quite a nice player. Some of you might remember the name Jack Ivory. He played in some open games, and he went to Michigan State, which I went to also. Mac had a riding stable in Detroit, and we rented out horses $1.50 an hour. This was during the war, and we'd ask somebody they'd come out with their money, and we'd say, "Do you know how to ride?" And they say, "Oh yeah, I know how to ride." They've ridden once or twice before, and so we'd put them on a horse, have to help them up and tell them which foot to put in the stirrup. And then we send them out in the pasture, and sometimes they'd fall off and the horse would come running back. But nobody sued you in those days. We never had a lawsuit. We had a lot of injuries, I think, if you look back. Once in a while, you'd get a smart aleck that said, I can ride anybody you have. And we'd say, bring out Midnight. And pretty soon Midnight would come riding back without a rider. He'd be running back to the barn. Or sometimes he'd be running back to the barn with the rider still on him, and we'd yell, "Duck your head! Duck your head!" Oh, God. Many close calls. Well, and then Mac got an invitation to go to Milwaukee to play in a tournament at a club called JoyFarm. So he loaded up, I think we only took 4 or 5 horses, because you doubled up in those days. You'd ride a horse the first and the third period, and then again in the second and fourth period. So you only needed 2 horses to play an indoor game. And we drove to Milwaukee, going through Chicago. I remember that. That was terrible. And when we got to Milwaukee, there were several good teams there. I think Del Carroll had a team, and the Healy brothers had a team. The Healys were Tom and Mike Healy. and Danny Peacock. That was their team. Tom was the father of Dan Healy, who some of you would know. And that trip to Milwaukee changed both our lives. Mac ended up buying the JoyFarm, and I ended up getting an invitation to go to Chicago and play at the Chicago Avenue Armory in a tournament indoor. And JoyFarm is quite a place. They had a summer day camp, and they had a couple buses. They would pick up kids in downtown Milwaukee and bring them out to the farm, and they'd raise the flag. And they had over 100 kids, I think. And then they'd divide them up into groups. They'd play volleyball, they'd ride horses, they'd swim. They fed them lunch. And Mac fell in love with the place. And he ran it then from before 1950 to 1970. And he died in 1970 on a polo field. He had I guess a heart attack and just fell off his horse. And he always said he wanted to die with his boots on. And he did.
And have the horses run over him. That didn't happen. He wanted that. He did.
And we spread his ashes over the polo field. My experience at the Chicago Avenue Armory was something. I played there for 17 consecutive years indoor, and most of my polo was indoor polo from 1948 until 1970. I was in my mid-40s before I played much outdoor. And there were some good teams that we had indoor, too. Del Carroll was one of the best players. He would go crashing around Del had one speed, and that was wide open. He's sticking ball wide open. I mean, he only had one. You wouldn't want to get him mad at you, though.
Well, all his horses came off the track, too.
Yeah, he became one of the best horse trainers. And he was killed on it. He took a horse that they were having a lot of trouble with on the racetrack. The horse, he was going to train it, and he took it out on the track. He was the best rider you ever saw, Del was. He was not only a good polo player, but a great rider. And the horse came back, and Del was found dead on the track. It's amazing what accidents you can have on a horse, as Bob Daniels just did. We're so sorry to hear.
What are the dimensions of an indoor arena?
They can be whatever the arena is.
Yeah, but it,
The Chicago Avenue Armory was just perfect, as a Squadron A Armory in New York was a good one too. And they were a little over 300 feet long and about maybe 100 feet, 120 feet wide. But there's a lot of indoor rings that are much smaller. And what we called indoor then was an enclosed arena. It was like an armory or some indoor arena with a roof on it. We called it indoor-outdoor if it didn't have a roof. And the indoor-outdoor arenas were usually a little larger. Some of them were like 400, 450 feet long. And you get the running a little bit more. JoyFarm had an indoor arena and an indoor-outdoor arena. And they had some good teams coming there. Meryl was there, and he played in the indoor-outdoor. They played on Friday nights. And Mac had just come to JoyFarm at that time. And then Meryl bought his first horse from JoyFarm, from Don McCarroll. And he told him, remember, Meryl, it is, what did he say, Meryl? It's a team game. You don't play alone, right? Mac has several sayings. It's never the horse, it's always the rider.
True.
Yeah. Well, let me, I have a St. Louis story, too, for Steve. At Oakbrook, you know, when I got Paul Butler owned Oakbrook, the Oakbrook Polo Club. Oakbrook, back in the 40s and early 50s, was simply the Paul Butler's polo fields. That was Oakbrook. He had 14 fields, and he had local teams come in and play, usually in June and July, and then some high goalers and the berries would come. And by the berries, I mean Old Roy, Big Roy, and Bill Berry, who a lot of you might not even know because they go back to the 40s. And then later, their younger brother, Harold Berry, who was Joe Berry's father, came. And these boys, these Berries from Texas, that was when television was first coming in. It was in, around 50. They were sitting in the club room there one time watching television. They were laughing at those Westerns. There were so many Westerns on television. And Roy said to Bill, he said, look at the hats on those cowboys. And they laughed. Because they were regular cowboys. Getting back to Steve, at Oakbrook, there'd always be a big game. And everyone would come out to this big game, and it was the Orthwines against the Kremls. And Dolph Orthwine and his two boys, and it was Jim Kreml and his two boys, and then they'd have a fourth player. And there was more yelling in that game, and that's what people came out to hear. It was a father yelling at the boys. And both, I don't know which father was the loudest. You know, another thing I remember about Steve is he played at the Eline field, which was nearby the JoyFarm, about a couple miles away. And he played in a 12-goal game. And he had the Bushes. The Bushes were just starting out in polo. And I want to tell you, Steve, you had one heck of a game. I remember you were the whole team. And I don't know if that was a Sunday or not, but you played in 2 games. Do you remember that?
The Bushes were great teammates. We had a lot of success playing with them.
Yeah.
You said you played mostly indoor polo. I never played indoor with you, but I played outdoor with you for at least 40 years, winning against you. So you played a lot of outdoor polo too, and we're damn good at it.
I was never over 3 goals outdoor.
You never had much to ride, but
He was usually on borrowed
you had it
horses.
here.
He didn't have any horses.
I didn't own a horse until I was in my mid-40s. I played all the indoor polo on mounted horses. People mounted me who I played with, the team that I played with. But I did play with Anuencia outside a couple years, and I got mounted by them. And we would travel around, and we'd go to St. Louis every year and play. And we'd handle St. Louis, pretty good, but until the Orthwine boys got older. And they kept growing up and getting bigger and better, and then we never won another game in St. Louis. I played at Eline Field, too. I want to talk about Benny Qataris. He was a perfectionist, and he played for Bob Eline in Milwaukee for many years. And I played a lot with Benny then, and that was in the 70s, I guess. And that's when I had my own horses. And Ruth did a lot of training of the horses. We'd buy a green horse, and Ruth would get it to neck rein and stop and everything.
It started. I wouldn't call it.
And then she'd say, it's about time you got on the horse.
If you're going to play this horse, you got to get on it.
And spoil them, yeah. But Benny,
A lot of hours.
then Jamie Eline and Robin Eline started to come into the game, and Jamie played with Benny for a couple years because Bob Eline had two teams, and Benny's team was kind of the traveling team, and then Jamie played with Benny, and
And you.
Benny, yeah, I played a lot on the team too. Benny, he'd never lose a game. I mean, he was so good in 12-goal polo. He was rated 6-7 goals, and he'd dominate the play. He was really good. Jamie didn't know what it was to lose a game. He started. I think he won his first 15 games or something, playing with Benny. One time, Benny he asked me if I'd go to Oakbrook with him to Chicago. He said they want a team there, and there's just you and me here, and they're going to give us a couple young players who are visiting there. And then he said, he looked at me. He said, I think we're going to have a pretty good team. And we went to Oakbrook, and who do we play with? But Bart Evans and Joe Barry. And Bart, they were both, I think, 1 goal. Bart went to 8 goals. Of course, Joe Barry went to 9. Joe could have gone to 10. I think there were a couple of years when Joe was the best player in the country. And the USPA had some kind of a fixation about nobody could be 10 goals except Cecil Smith. And he was 10 goals for over 20 years. And they wouldn't make any other player 10 goals. And there were several players that I thought, you come along in a summer of polo that you see in the big games, somebody stands out. And there were several years when Billy Mayer stood out. He was a backbone of a team. He played with Russell Firestone and Del Carroll, Ray Harrington, Doc Williams. Doc Williams, I think he was from Texas. He was quite a guy. He'd laugh and he'd go like that, and he'd laugh and laugh. He'd come to Oakbrook. He was a joy to play with. But Billy Mayer could have gone to 10. Another guy who I thought could have gone to 10 was Harold Berry. There were a couple of years when he stood out, really as maybe the best. And let's see, Little Roy. Little Roy, everybody had a lot of respect for him. Anybody who played against Little Roy was Roy could anticipate so well. That was the whole game. It was hitting a long ball and anticipating. There was no dribbling. If you dribbled, you got yelled at. You never turned the ball. If you turned the ball, oh God. I remember turning the ball once, and Benny really read me out. God, I never did it again. I think I lost it anyhow,
That's probably why I yelled.
Why don't you say a little bit about, because I think it was an important part of polo history, and you were part of it. Eline Field and just open, it's right across from Troy, but in the 70s, all those players, it was Oakbrook and Milwaukee. And Milwaukee would play the 20 goal, and Oakbrook would play the open, but all the players played up there in Milwaukee, and a lot of them stabled up there, and then they back and forth at play. So, and you played a lot of games with all those great players. That was what polo was in the 70s. That was it, really.
Yeah. Yeah, Bob Eline, he built the field in mid-50s, I think. And he had some great teams and some great players there. George Oliver played with Bob originally. George Oliver was 9 goals. And on the field, he would just scream and yell at Bob. They called Bob the captain. He said, "God darn it, captain, back the ball." And he'd just scream and yell at him. And Bob was paying him. You know, he was a pro, and he was yelling and screaming at him. And then after the game, Bob would always invite everyone over to his house. So everyone would go over to the big house.
Nice person.
And he'd have drinks and hors d'oeuvres and everything. It was always a great party. And there would be George Oliver with his arm around Bob, and they'd have a drink in their hand, and they were the best of friends. But geez, he'd yell at Bob so much. George had a great personality, though. George, he would remember your name if he met you once, and he'd call you by your name. He would remember your wife's name. Everybody just loved George. And he was a great player for many years.
About Tommy Wayman, too? Sinclair Hill?
You know, eventually they made people a 10-goal player, and that was Tommy Wayman, and deservedly so. He stood out as the best that time, and then they started putting 10 goals on people. Another story about George Oliver was, he was inducted in the Hall of Fame, one of the first people. And congratulations to Meryl for his induction. George Oliver, when he was inducted, they introduced him and to all kinds of beautiful things. And he stood up and he said, "You know, this reminds me of the time I was in a plane and I was going to bail out over Germany in a war. And I said to myself, how did I ever get into this?" And he sat down, never said another word. And you know who told me that story? It was Les Armour, Red Armour's father. And he said, it's a doggonest truth. He said he did that.
And how did you get into this?
How did I?
In polo.
In the polo? Well, my stepfather who got me in. My mother married Mac, and I was 14 years old, and he had some horses, and he played polo. And Mac is the one that got me in. And he had something to do with Meryl Jenkins starting. You know Dickie Riemenschneider?
Bobby
He
Eline.
started the JoyFarm. Bob Eline played his first polo at JoyFarm.
Tommy Goodspeed.
Tom Goodspeed learned under Mac. Mac would say, "Don't you look like a sack of potatoes on that horse?" Oh, geez. Let me tell you about going to Squadron A Armory in New York. Mac and I and Paul Smithson won the 12-goal tournament in Chicago, and that was the West. And so we were going to Squadron A Armory in New York to play against the team that won the East Championship. And the team that won the East Championship against Pinnell and Buddy Coombs and Zenas Colt and all those great players in New York was the Cornell team. And the Cornell team were the two Baldwins. The two Baldwins boys Peter and Ben, and they played with, I think it was Woolaway or something, Woolaway. And one of the reasons they beat everybody is it was on handicap, and you gave them 4 or 5 goals to start with. But anyhow, we played them, and we made up the handicap pretty quickly, and then we went into the last period kind of even, and they outplayed us just tremendously the last period. They shot for a goal, I'll bet 10, 15 times, and just missed, and we ended up tied at the end of the game. And we went into overtime, and Paul Smithson, our 1-goal player, made the winning goal. And Peter Ball, whenever I see him, he remembers that game. Well, let me tell you, too, about Peter Perkins. When I first started in polo, I tried to get everything I could read on polo. The rules, and I'd read. I got a hold of a blue book, and I read about Peter Perkins and Cecil Smith, Stuart Eaglehart, and oh, geez, what stars! And I was just awed by them. And little did I know that in several years I would be playing with these guys. And it wasn't long after I got started that Ivory got Stuart Eaglehart to come to Detroit and play on Ivory's field in the indoor-outdoor game there on a Sunday. And Eaglehart came. He was rated 10 goals inside and outside. And he tried Ivory's horses. Ivory was mounting him. The deal was he's going to pick his own horses. And he tried about 6 or 7 and picked out 2. And he doubled up on those 2 and played in the game. And that was an experience, playing against him. I played with the Ivory Rangers then. It was Jack Ivory and Max Stefani, who was Mr. Ivory's son-in-law, and me. And when Eaglehart hit the ball, it was like a different sound. It was like an explosion. And I guess it's the speed that he brought his mallet up against the ball. But I heard that same sound when Tom Goodspeed hit the ball. And Tom was a great player. Yeah, he is a great player. Yeah, good instructor too. And Memo Gracita. I got a story about Memo too. Art Mertz and Dick Tauber got the Armory back in the 70s. And they had been to Mexico, and they invited Giuseppe Iavardo, was that his last name, that they got to know when they were in Mexico. He was an Italian, but he lived in Mexico and he owned a restaurant, and they got to be good friends, and they invited Giuseppe to come to Chicago to the Armory, which they were running, and bring a Mexican team. And Giuseppe said, well, I'll just bring one player over. And he brought this young boy, 17 years old. His name was Memo Gracita. And when he hit the ball, it was like an explosion. He was rated, I guess, 17 years old. I think it was 4 or 5 goals at the time indoor. And that was an experience. Tauber was mounting him, and he was telling me about the horse, and he said, now this horse doesn't stop too well, and he doesn't turn too well to the right, but you could, and Membo, he didn't understand a lot of English, and he says, do you have a whip? Do you have a whip? And Tauber kept saying, well, now when you go to the, Membo says, the whip, you got a whip. And that's all he wanted. Never mind how the horses go, he'll ride the horse. Just he wanted it to go. Okay, what else? I don't.
How about when you were in the in the service and you.
Oh, yeah. If you think I go way back, you know how old Cecil Smith was playing back in the 20s and 30s? I met the guy that brought Cecil Smith into the game, and his name was George Miller. And he had a ranch in Texas. And it was called the Miller Ranch, and he had a dirt polo field. And I was stationed in San Antonio in the mid '40s, and I heard about, I had read about Miller and Cecil, and so I would take a bus from the base into town. And then I take a bus in town to the end of the line, and then there was a dirt road, and I'd walk about, it was over a mile, I think, and I found that's where the Miller Ranch was.
The hardships of being in the service.
Yeah, I didn't do much in the service. And Miller had this dirt polo field, a stable, and he had a couple homes on the place, and he lived in one of them. Cecil Smith lived in another one. And I went up to the door, and I knocked on the door, and this old fellow opened the door, and I said, I play polo in Detroit, and I'm wondering if I could ride. And he looked at me. I thought he was going to slam the door in my face. But he said, come on out. And he walked me out to the stable, and he said, saddle up that horse. And he showed me the saddle and the bridle, and he said, okay, get up and ride over there and ride back. And I took the horse, and I rode it over there, and he said, okay, run it back. And I ran it back. He said, okay, you can ride. And then I used to go out there. Every time I got off on weekends, I'd go over there and I'd stick and ball, and I'd always I knew where the horses were and the tack and everything, and then I'd stop in at the house where he was, and we'd sit down in the kitchen and we'd talk for a while, and he chewed tobacco, and we'd be talking, and he'd turn around and he'd spit, and he never got near the spittoon, and he spit, and he spit, and his wife, a very charming gal, a little bit younger than him, much younger, would come around, and she had a little mop, and she would mop up, and she really took care of him. One time I rode, and then I stopped up at the house and knocked at the door, and she answered the door, and she had tears in her eyes. Her eyes were red, and she said that George had died. That was, I didn't ride after that.
But you met Cecil there, didn't you?
What?
You met Cecil there, didn't you?
Yes, I did meet Cecil there, yeah. And then later I played at Oakbrook with Cecil. I was talking about Peter Perkins. Paul Butler gave me a house to live in. Am I talking too much?
No.
Paul Butler gave me a house to live in. It was across from his house. It was called one of the river houses. And whenever he had, I was going to Northwestern at the time. And he was a very generous guy. Paul never talked much. I mean, you hardly could get him to talk. Did you know him, Steve? Yeah, Meryl, did you? Yeah. He wouldn't. He wouldn't hardly say anything. He was almost. It was like he was shy, and but he was a generous man, and he had close to 3,000 acres, and that was Oakbrook, polo fields and homes, and he owned all the homes, and the people in the homes were his friends that he rented to. Never sold anything, or people who worked for him and lived in the homes rent-free. Anyhow, I lived in his house, and if he had guests and he couldn't put them up at his house, they'd come over to where I was, because it was a 3-bedroom place, and they'd stay with me. And well, one time, one summer, the Gracita boys came and stayed with me, and that's the father of Reuben, father of Memo, and their uncles. They didn't speak English, and we didn't have too much trouble getting into, I don't know, we somehow communicated, but they were a fun bunch and good players, those 4 boys. Anyhow, one time Peter came over and stayed at the house too, so I lived with Peter Perkins for a few years. It was right after his divorce from Surratt, and his father, Earl Perkins, was running the polo in Hawaii and wanted a team, and Peter, I don't know why, but he asked me to go with him. And he and Sam Dean from the Dean Milk Company, which is now the Dean Foods, milk distributors, we went to Hawaii, and what a trip that was. We went on a Pan Am plane, and it took forever to get there. Yeah. It wasn't 4 or 5 hours. It was like 6 or 8 hours crossing the ocean, and they had berths on the plane, and it was like a train. A curtain would go up over your seats, and you'd have a berth. You could put your pajamas on and go to bed and sleep overnight. Then you'd land in Hawaii, which we did, and there was a band playing, and hula dancers, and they put lace over your neck, and I was in heaven. And then we played. We were there 2 weeks, and we played about 3 games, and I met Manduke Baldwin, Peter Baldwin's father, Manduke, and he was one of the original 5 families in Hawaii, the Baldwins. He owned half of Maui, I think, and there were others, some names I can't even remember now, but as far as form was concerned in polo, I think Peter Perkins had the best form. He looked like a symphony out there when he hit the ball. It was just beautiful form, and he had a beautiful tail shot. And another one who had great form was Charles Smith. And I think those were the 2 best forms in polo. Hugo Delmar played at Oakbrook too. Do any of you remember Hugo Delmar? We always said that Hugo was well mounted, a great guy. He played indoor in Chicago and also at Oakbrook. And somebody said, well, he should be well mounted. He just bought a couple ponies from Cecil Smith, and he paid $3,500 a piece for them. God, was he mounted? Yeah. We used to tell Hugo, you look good going to the ball, and I don't know if that was a compliment or not.
What were some of your most memorable games that you played?
Oh, I have several of those. Let me see. Well, playing against the Baldwins and Squadron A Armory was one. Playing again in the Squadron A Armory on television was another. I played with Ylvasacker and Pat Connors, and it was a 6-period game, and it was televised live on Sunday afternoon, the Sports Spectacular, I think it was.
Play with Davey Rizzo against Davey
We played against Herbie Pennell and Dave Rizzo
I have that film,
and Dave and Ellis.
and I've shown that film a couple of times, and actually the outtake where do you remember when
When they were
Davey Rizzo's horse tries to jump out of the,
Yes.
out of
Davey Rizzo went off the field in the game. His horse crashed into the boards, and he went over the horse's head and off the field. And that was, that's on the on the tape.
But I amplified it. I actually had it. I have it in slow mo, so you could back up and you can see it. And of course, when Davey went over, whoever was the fourth man on the team said, "You're hurt. Stay down." So, and he, of course, Davey got up and went back.
Oh, he came right back up. He jumped up.
Yes. But Herbie grew up next to me in Danvers.
Yeah.
We called him Herbie Pennell then. His family still all the Pennells, but.
Herbie was a great indoor player. Boy, he could miss the ball and reach back and get it. I mean, he missed the ball and he'd swing so fast that he would reach back at the tail and pick the ball up again. He was a great player. Yeah,
I
that.
have to look at that film again now because we have all the interviews on it. Remember all when you guys are all interviewed by the sportscasters and stuff. So now I'm gonna have to look at that again.
Because they asked him how he was, and he said he didn't know because he'd just gotten there or something. He slept.
Yep. Yep.
He didn't get any sleep.
Yeah, Dave often kids Rizzo all the time because Rizzo says that the timekeeper was against us. He said, "Yeah, we won the game. they were ahead." And he said he said that last period went about 10 minutes. But the whole thing was on television, and it was that was an experience. And at Baldwin's, and then going to Hawaii with Peter. Another good experience, a big game, was playing with Joe Barry in the Continental Cup. I think it was about 18 goals. And that's when Joe was really the best player, I think, in the country at the time. And they said, Joe met us once before the game, and he said, "You know what they called our team?" He said they called it the garbage team. And we were playing against the team with Roy Barry, another Billy Lindfoot.
Who else was on your team?
Oh, yeah. Joe had three goal players on his team. It was myself and Jamie Eline and Mulcahy. Mulcahy. Yeah.
Yeah, and Joe kept yelling at Billy all the time. Because he,
And when I played with Joe in Milwaukee, I would be playing with Joe, and there'd be a couple Elines on the field, so he couldn't yell at them. He wasn't like George Oliver, but he yelled at me. It was like I'm the only guy on the field with Billy. I felt like Bob Eline and George Oliver yelling at us. And playing against Joe was an experience, though. When he'd go to knock in, I would line up around the 30, 40-yard mark, and then I'd bust out as he came to knock in. And people would be looking at me and say, where are you going? You know, like, where are you going? And I'd go by him, and pretty soon Joe would hit the ball about midfield. He was the longest ball hitter, I think, ever, yeah. You know, one time I remember going to Detroit, Meryl, and I don't know if I ever told you this, but it was a father and son, I think, tournament you had there, and I had my son Jimmy with me. And we went to Detroit, and we stabled there, and we were in the tournament. And I never saw it in any of the Detroit players. They didn't greet us. They didn't have a party. They didn't do anything except Meryl Jenkins. I remember Meryl coming over and talking with us and asking if we wanted to go out and have a drink and do things. And Meryl, you're a very good host and the only one there.
Was that the time you were on your way to Canada?
Yes, we were on our way to Toronto. That's another story, playing against the Siftons in Toronto. I went there about 10 different times. It was a long drive. It was about 14 hours from Milwaukee. And they had the classic charity games in,
4th of July.
over the 4th in Toronto.
All over Hart.
And you know, you play for so many games and you get a butter plate. Or you, at the Armory, we would play for 3 months, January, February, and March, and then only the winning team would get a trophy, and that could be a money clip or a butter plate or something. So we go to Toronto this time, and it's a Rolex watch for the winning team. And oh, jeez. And so who do we play against? Sifton's boys and Todd Offen. And we, no, Todd. It was Todd. And we killed him. We killed him, but we didn't win the game. We outplayed them like the Baldwins outplayed us in that 4th period at Squadron A. We outplayed them 4 periods. Shot for goal. Cliff Sifton could hardly raise his arm. He knocked in so much. We couldn't make a goal, and then near the end of the game, Derek Sifton made a goal. They won the game, and they got Rolex watches. We didn't even get a butter plate.
That's not true. We got sheets for the horses, which I was very happy about.
Well, Ruth appreciated that more than me wearing a watch. You know, one time we did go there once, and we got our weight, our captain's weight in Glen Levitt Scotch, and we won that game.
So nobody was very big.
And what was funny, too, was because the guy from Glen Levitt was there, a couple of guys, and they had these cases of Glen Levitt, and we picked the heaviest guy to be the captain. You guessed it. And that was George Alexander, because my boys and I were all lighter than George. And so George stood on the scale, and my son Charlie put his foot on the scale, and George's weight went way up. But you know, then Charlie kind of laughed and took his foot off like it was a joke. And then they were going to give us like 6 or 8 cases, and then he took his foot off, and we ended up we did get 5 cases. And so we each took a case, and we gave a case to the losing team. Let me think if there's another game. If there are any questions, I'll think of
You played with your boys.
Oh yeah, we won the Arena Open a couple of times, and I played with my sons. Those were big games. Oh, yeah.
Did you play the boys from Pierre?
With what?
Pierre, South Dakota? Did they come down in the spring?
Pierre, South Dakota. Bud Tyler.
Bud Tyler, yeah.
Bud
Never had martingales on his horses.
Bud Tyler. He didn't bandage his horses. Didn't have a martingale, and he had a great offside backhand. I remember. But Bud was a great guy. Yeah, he was. He should have been a cowboy.
I think he was.
He.
Those horses in, they'd hardly been rich.
Yeah. You remember Bud Tyler.
Well, this was gold. Absolute